So here's an interesting question I'm going to put to you, which I think you intuitively probably know the answer to, which is, does being in a narcissistic relationship, could it age us or make us age faster? Most of you are saying, absolutely. Well, there is some new science out there that I was reading that seems to suggest that the answer to that question actually and definitively may be yes. The findings of this research study were actually quite sobering, a little bit surprising, and actually an interesting way for us to think about our narcissistic relationships. It's researchers who are actually finally giving us evidence. Maybe they weren't looking at narcissism, but definitely evidence that unhealthy relationships may not be good for our health, may actually result in faster biological aging, poorer physical health, and higher reports of mental health symptoms. Now, again, any of us who have ever been through one of these unhealthy relationships, we knew this in our bones, but these scientists, these scholars have given us the evidence. Now, the researchers who did this work were in a variety of disciplines, including sociology and aging. So their focus isn't so much into the trauma and the narcissism of it all. They were really kind of thin slicing this, but they're saying something really important. I really want to give a shout out to BK Lee from NYU and his colleagues from around the country for this study. Because again, we're going to put the link to the abstract and the study in the show notes. If you want to look at the original study, I was actually really quite impressed by it. Now, what Lee and his colleagues' studies focuses on, they don't focus on narcissism per se, and they don't call it toxic people in their article. Instead, they focus on a very specific phenomenon or people that they call hasslers. Now, in simple terms, hasslers are the people who cause problems in life. They're the people who make demands. They're the people who make life difficult. And for their research, they focused on the people who were rated as often being hasslers in the respondents' lives. Not just a here or there hasslers, but most of the time, often was a hassler. Now, this hassling thing is already quite important and interesting. It's a very interesting thread to me of what does happen in every narcissistic relationship. And it's a dynamic that's we probably see this hassling dynamic more often with, I'd say, the vulnerable narcissistic folks who tend to be a bit whiny. But it could also be seen in malignant narcissistic folks who are saying things like, where were you? Who are you seeing? What are you doing? I better not find out you did this. I better not find out you did that. What are you spending that money on? You see that? And even with the self-righteous narcissistic folks, the really nitpicky rule kind of stuff. These tend to be very hassly subtypes of narcissism. Now, I would argue that what happens in these kinds of narcissistic relationships goes way above and beyond just a hassle. But the hassling part of it is there for sure in a narcissistic relationship. This idea of a person who makes demands, causes problems in life, and makes life difficult, that's the damned definition of a narcissistic relationship, okay? Relationships with people who are not narcissistic, if you really look at their study, now they can still be hassler relationships. But a person can be a hassler and not narcissistic. For example, you may not see the dysregulation. You may not see the entitlement. You may not see the pathological selfishness. But that person without those qualities could still be a hassler. But let's face it, it's very likely that almost every single narcissistic person is a hassler. They make life difficult. Now, what these researchers found is that the number of hasslers in a person's life matters. And each additional hassler a person had in their lives was associated with faster biological aging. They measured aging with something called DNA methylation-based aging clocks. And they also looked at other health outcomes such as inflammation and the presence of other health conditions. Now, they weren't specifically looking for people who were in toxic relationships. They were just looking at a sample of people. And they didn't go out to just find people in hassly relationships. They did find that hassling was relatively common. And about 30% of the sample that they studied, which is just regular folks, had at least one person who qualified as a hassler in their social network. And 10% of their sample had two or more people who often hassled them. Okay, so it's not uncommon. Other interesting things that they found are that women had more hasslers in their lives. That absolutely did not surprise me. That people who had more hasslers in their lives were also more likely to have had more adverse childhood experiences. Again, that's not surprising. People who had more hasslers had larger social networks. Statistically, that makes sense. More people, more likelihood of hassling. And interestingly, were more likely to be current smokers. Again, not surprising. You got to cope somehow. It gets interesting because people who reported more hasslers, having more hasslers in their lives, were those who felt lots of other people depended on them. Now, people who had zero hasslers, big surprise, had better health. And people who viewed themselves as more important to other people had fewer hasslers. I thought about that. And this could be one of two things. It could be that those people who felt that they were important in other people's lives felt valued, so they were less likely to perceive hassling in their midst, or they might have had a little grandiose thing going on and may have been the problem. These researchers didn't look at that point in that way. Now, people with more social and more health vulnerabilities report having more exposure to hasslers. That starts becoming a chicken-egg issue. What comes first, the problems or the hasslers? So let's look at it this way. If you have more than one narcissistic relationship, which is kind of like having more than one hassler, and just about everyone who has one narcissistic relationship in their lives has more than one narcissistic relationship in their lives, means you have multiple hasslers in your life, right? Crappy relationships in general are a form of chronic stress, and chronic stress is associated with all sorts of bad outcomes, including increased inflammation, worse immune function, cardiovascular risks, and more rapid biological aging. Crappy relationships are not good for us. People who are in these unhealthy relationships get sick more often, get more severe illnesses, don't get better as quickly, and on top of that, it is likely that in their hassle-filled world, they also may not have enough support. How can you when everyone's making your life difficult? Now, even though people reported actually higher hassling levels from people like roommates and coworkers, where this gets interesting is those kinds of relationships didn't have the same health impact as hassling that comes from family relationships, siblings, parents, that kind of thing. A finding that was actually really interesting to me and kind of defied what I would have expected is that spouse and partner hassling wasn't associated with poorer health outcomes. It's an important point, and I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. But in general, hassling, though, this is again an interesting point too, hassling from people who kind of matter less and aren't as central to your life kind of sort of doesn't have the same impact. Now, relationships that involve obligation and interdependence, again, family, create more of a hassler impact. And involuntary relationships like friends, we might see less. We don't have any choice in our families, right? And while coworkers were often listed as hasslers in people's sort of responses, perhaps there's less of the social obligation from the work hassling that creates the health impact. So those coworker hassling that was there, but it didn't have the same kind, like I said, of health impact. But their big finding in this study was that the family hasslers were the most impactful because these are enduring, long-term relationships and difficult to escape. And I would also argue that these are relationships that are developmental. Parent hasslers, sibling hasslers, other family hasslers, most of them have been around since your childhood. So this is a lifetime burden. And the obligations may be more profoundly felt. Obviously, we have little choice with these folks, and the hasslers are harder to deal with anyhow. And this is all consistent with what they found. Now, people who have more difficult life histories, like I said, I talked about this a moment ago, having more adverse childhood experiences means not only the lifetime burden, but then also the risk of adult relationships with more demanding and difficult, kinds of qualities. It's a really terrible double whammy. There's already the physiological risk you have from the lifelong history of exposure to these adversities. But then you continue to have these hassling family members in your life, which just foster social networks that create more stress. Now, these authors called this, in their words, relational inequality, which to me felt like a way of calling this sort of intergenerational or developmental. It starts in childhood, it carries into adulthood, it makes us more likely to get sick, it takes years off our lives, and then it affects subsequent generations. Their data support what we have always known about narcissistic family systems. These dynamics undermine people from the start, makes them more vulnerable to getting mental and physical health issues, and keeps them stuck in family structures that continue to make them sick because the hasslers have more of that obligation demand. Let's go back, though, to that issue around the spouse hasslers, the partner hasslers not being an issue. That was interesting. And when I really dug deep into their study, you got to keep in mind that the people that these researchers were studying were just regular people. They were not necessarily people who were saying, I'm in a narcissistic relationship. So as a result, what might have been happening is even if the person said, my spouse is often a hassler, there may have still been other times the relationship was helpful or served other useful or good functions, so the health impacts didn't show up the same way as family impacts did. Now, their findings found that people could be hasslers, often be hasslers in your life, but if they were ticking other boxes in your life, then it didn't have the same health effects. The authors make some points that I really do believe reflect what we know about the patterns associated with narcissistic, antagonistic, and generally toxic relationships. That when they are in our lives, we endure these relationships. And if you grew up this way, you may even think that this is just how relationships are. So while these researchers are focusing on this specific strand, the specific issue of hassling, they make a key point. Having supportive ties, and you know I'm all about that. Support's great. Having supportive ties is great. Actually, it can actually help protect against biological aging, is great. But there are also people out there who don't have supportive ties, but at the same time, they also don't have these negative hassler ties. Then there are the people out there who do have the negative ties, and it's probably you if you are watching this channel. Now again, going back to these authors, Lee and his colleagues, according to them, family members who are hasslers are not always considered to be close, like close to the core of you, right? And the hasslers weren't found to be as interlinked into the person's life who was answering the survey. But family creates a unique problem. They are embedded in a person's life, well, because they're family, right? You're kind of stuck with them. Now, embeddedness can be good sometimes, right? Especially when you're embedded in a system where it means structural support and it can be a source of protection. But it can sort of suck when the hasslers are part of the structure, this embedded structure, and they don't offer other supports and aren't judged to be that close to you, right? They're not in your core, right? Then they just become something that makes you sick and age faster with absolutely no value add. So without getting too much into the weeds, I have to say I really commend these researchers for doing this work. It's a puzzle piece I've been searching for. Research like this is difficult to do. Now, it's also difficult to interpret. Their study, all their data was gathered at one point in time, and we are trying to draw conclusions about long-term health. But I really read their study carefully. They really analyzed their data in very thoughtful ways that support their hypothesis and sort of rule out some confounding explanation. And finding that negative social ties, what they call hasslers, shapes future health and biological aging, and not in a good way. While this study supported what I've always suspected and I've seen through decades of clinical practice, it also kind of chilled me a bit because of what it really does mean in the long term for people who are in long-term narcissistic relationships. Now, these researchers are focusing, again, on just one slice, one thread, the hassling part. And these people are not formally saying they're in narcissistic marriages. So I think that lack of a spouse effect on biological aging and health outcomes may mean that in regular marriages, where, yeah, I'm sure a spouse can be a hassle, the other good stuff is sort of an offset. But people in narcissistic relationships in general often don't have enough that will soften the hassling effect, the way that these researchers saw it in their study. Their study does show that having a hassling family and family members is part and parcel of a larger framework of having adverse childhood experiences, which would then imply that having a narcissistic parent or family members can definitely set people up on a downward trajectory of bad health over the lifespan. And the severity of the totality of what happens in narcissistic relationships, folks, it's much worse than just hassling. So that means we can also speculate that the acceleration of biological aging and the inflammation and the health issues and the anxiety and the depression, all of that is likely to be worse than when it's more than just hassling. And with narcissistic folks, it's likely that there is not the luxury that the hassler is also bringing in some good stuff to offset all their hassly stuff. Remember too, hassling is not manipulation. It's just ask, difficult, demand. And for most people in these relationships, I'll tell you, in a narcissistic relationship, hassling seems like small potatoes compared to manipulation, betrayal, gaslighting, blame shifting, all of it. Listen, someone asking you to empty the dishwasher all the time or is pissed off at you for not writing them a thank you note on time, that's going to seem like paradise compared to the manipulative shitstorm of a narcissistic relationship, right? So even right there, those don't feel like they're on even ground together. This study, though, supports the very, very likely premise that unhealthy, unsafe, antagonistic, narcissistic, call them what you will, toxic relationships may shorten the lifespan, make you more vulnerable to illness. And because narcissistic systems, particularly family systems, but even marriages, can be very difficult to get out of, and so you may not have the good, positive relationships in your life that are a buffer because you get isolated, all of it. The inflammation, the hits to your immune system, the aging, the mental health issues, it's all real. And note to all of you longevity-obsessed folks who probably aren't watching this video, but you're sleeping in oxygen tents and doing cold plunges and prescribing minestrone for breakfast and avoiding processed food and perfect optimized sleep routines. I am sure that stuff is great. But it ain't just that. We have got to find a way to protect people from these kinds of relationships, difficult, toxic, demanding relationships, and protect and care for the people who are in these relationships because they are not easy to get out of. We have to address the harms of emotionally abusive family systems and do it early for kids and have a therapy system that is willing to call this stuff out rather than to enable the BS of abusers and harassers and hasslers that it's always been doing. It's not as simple as go out and find positive support. That's hard to do when you're being isolated and you've been worn down to a tiny nub of yourself and there is nothing left of you. We definitely, again, this study is great, but we need more research like this. And perhaps it confirms what we already suspected, but when we have the hard data like these scholars have provided, it can really sometimes muscle up how we train therapists, build curriculum, and make policy. But at a minimum, it can at the very least ungaslight us. Yeah, these relationships are making us sick. So you may have wondered, as you struggle through a narcissistic relationship and say, this is killing me, it feels like it's making me sick, it's safe to say that the answer may be yes. Again, shout out to the researchers on this one. It's a great paper. The details on the study are in the video notes. Thanks again.